What do you call a government that spends hundreds of hours of taxpayer-funded diplomatic effort to bring someone back to Britain who openly despises Britain? According to Robert Jenrick, you call them mugs. And honestly, after what we're about to discuss, you might struggle to disagree. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where today we're watching the Shadow Justice Secretary absolutely detonate on GB News over the return of Abd El-Fattah, the activist whose social media history makes your weird conspiracy theorist uncle look well-adjusted. Jenrick didn't just express concern or mild disappointment, he erupted. We're talking full volcanic explosion, complete with accusations that government officials should hang their heads in shame and that British voters are being treated like absolute mugs. Grab your popcorn because this is spicy, and it's only getting spicier as we go. Let's dive in. So here's the setup. On Boxing Day, while most of Britain was in that weird post-Christmas limbo where you're not sure what day it is or whether it's acceptable to eat chocolate for breakfast, Keir Starmer decided to drop a statement. He announced that Abd El-Fattah, a British-Egyptian dual national who'd been imprisoned in Egypt, was back in the UK and reunited with his loved ones. Starmer called this a top priority for his government and basically positioned it as a diplomatic win, a victory for human rights and British values. Except there was one tiny problem. Well, actually several massive problems, all relating to Abd El-Fattah's extremely problematic social media history that apparently nobody in government bothered to check before rolling out the welcome wagon. Cut to GB News, where Robert Jenrick is sitting across from Alex Armstrong and you can practically see the steam coming out of his ears. Armstrong, being the thorough journalist he is, immediately puts Jenrick on the spot by asking about James Cleverly and other Conservative MPs who had previously supported Abd El-Fattah's release. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just a Labour initiative. The previous Tory government had also lobbied for his release. Cleverly had tweeted about working tirelessly to secure his freedom, so Armstrong's question is essentially, aren't your own people complicit in this mess? Now, this is where Jenrick could have dodged, deflected, or done the typical politician thing of defending his colleagues regardless of the facts. But credit where it's due, he didn't. Instead, he acknowledged the uncomfortable truth while also throwing the entire system under the bus. He said his fellow MPs perhaps didn't know the extent of Abd El-Fattah's previous tweets, giving them the benefit of the doubt while simultaneously making clear that ignorance isn't an excuse when you're dealing with something this serious. It's the political equivalent of saying, they messed up, but maybe they didn't know they were messing up, but that doesn't make it okay. Then Jenrick dropped the bombshell that really captures how deep this dysfunction goes. He said Abd El-Fattah should never have been given British citizenship in 2021, and that he's ashamed the last Conservative government did that. Let that sink in for a moment. A senior Conservative MP is publicly stating he's ashamed of his own party's decision. That's not normal political point scoring. That's genuine embarrassment about a catastrophic failure of judgment. When politicians are willing to throw their own side under the bus, you know something has gone seriously wrong. But Jenrick wasn't finished, not even close. He went after the Foreign Office officials who, in his words, wasted hundreds and hundreds of hours of their time which should have been spent pursuing genuine British interests to bring Abd El-Fattah to the UK. Think about that for a second. Hundreds of hours of diplomatic effort, taxpayer-funded salaries, government resources, all dedicated to bringing someone back to Britain who, based on his own social media posts, appears to despise Britain. It's like spending months planning a surprise party for someone who hates parties, hates surprises, and specifically hates you. The level of counterproductive effort is almost impressive. Jenrick said these officials should hang their heads in shame. That's strong language, and it's deserved. When you're a civil servant working in the Foreign Office, your job is to advance British interests abroad. Protect British citizens, yes, but in a way that aligns with broader national interests and values. Spending hundreds of hours lobbying for the release of someone who's called for violence against British people, who's expressed hatred of white people, who's advocated killing Zionists and police officers, that's not advancing British interests. That's advancing someone's misguided ideological agenda while ignoring the actual consequences. Then came Jenrick's observation that really cuts to the heart of why this matters. He said this whole situation tells you everything you need to know about the failure of the British government in recent years. And he's right. This isn't just about one activist or one bad decision. It's about a systemic failure where virtue signaling and appearing progressive on human rights matters more than actually thinking through the implications of your actions. It's about a government apparatus that's so focused on ticking boxes and following process that nobody stops to ask the obvious question: should we actually be doing this? But the moment that really went viral, the line that's being quoted everywhere, came when Jenrick looked directly at the camera and said, "Your viewers watching tonight will think that they are mugs." And you know what? He's absolutely right. If you're a British taxpayer who's been told there's no money for public services, that tough decisions need to be made, that we all need to tighten our belts, and then you discover that your government spent hundreds of hours and God knows how much money bringing back someone who hates Britain, you're going to feel like a mug. You're going to feel like you've been taken for a ride, that your concerns don't matter, and that the people running the country are completely disconnected from reality. The backlash to Starmer's Boxing Day statement has been intense and immediate. Social media erupted with people asking why the Prime Minister was celebrating the arrival of someone whose violent rhetoric is freely available online. One user captured the absurdity perfectly by asking, "Do you still have those laws to put people in jail for mean tweets?" Because that's the glaring hypocrisy here. Britain has prosecuted people for offensive social media posts, for tweets that caused offense or could be interpreted as threatening. We've had cases where people were arrested, charged, and convicted for things they said online. And yet, here's someone whose posts include explicit calls for violence, expressions of racial hatred, and advocacy for killing police officers, and the Prime Minister is delighted he's back. Let's talk about some of those posts, because context is important. According to the Times of Israel, Abd El-Fattah wrote on November 15, 2012, "There is a critical number of Israelis that we need to kill, and then the Palestine problem is solved." That's not political criticism. That's not expressing support for Palestinian rights or opposing Israeli government policy. That's advocating genocide. That's saying we need to kill enough members of a national group to eliminate them as a problem. If someone wrote, "There is a critical number of Muslims we need to kill and then the immigration problem is solved," they would rightly be arrested immediately for inciting racial hatred and violence. But apparently, when the target is Israelis, it gets a pass from government officials. This brings us back to the question Jenrick asked in his letter to the Prime Minister. Did you know about these statements before you issued your delighted message? It's a simple yes or no question, but the implications of either answer are devastating. If Starmer knew about the statements, then he consciously decided to publicly celebrate the arrival of someone who's called for mass murder. That would be a moral failure of staggering proportions. If he didn't know, then it means nobody in the entire governmental apparatus thought to inform the Prime Minister about readily available information before he made a public statement. That would be an administrative and procedural failure that calls into question the basic competence of how government operates. Jenrick's point about the 2021 citizenship decision is particularly important because it shows this isn't just a Labour problem. The previous Conservative government granted Abd El-Fattah citizenship, despite the fact that his extremist social media posts were publicly known. The European Parliament had withdrawn him for a Peace Prize nomination years earlier, specifically because of these posts. So the information was out there, it was accessible, it was relevant, and somehow the Home Office still decided to grant citizenship. That suggests either a catastrophic failure of vetting procedures or a deliberate decision to ignore problematic information because it was ideologically inconvenient. The Foreign Office officials who Jenrick says should hang their heads in shame clearly made Abd El-Fattah's case a priority. They spent significant time and resources lobbying the Egyptian government for his release. They coordinated with international partners. They briefed ministers. They treated this as an important case worthy of substantial diplomatic capital. And at no point did anyone apparently say, "Hang on, should we be checking whether this person's views align with British values before we invest all this effort?" That's not just an oversight, that's a fundamental failure of judgment. What makes this even more frustrating is that Abd El-Fattah was genuinely persecuted by the Egyptian government. He was imprisoned for years, went on hunger strikes, and by all accounts suffered for his political activism. There's a legitimate human rights dimension to his case. The problem is that being a victim of one form of oppression doesn't automatically make you a hero or someone whose arrival should be celebrated. Sometimes victims of authoritarian regimes hold deeply illiberal views themselves. Sometimes people who fight for freedom in one context advocate state tyranny and others. Recognizing that complexity shouldn't be controversial, but apparently in modern British governance it is. The characterization of British people as mugs for tolerating the situation is particularly powerful because it taps into a deep well of frustration. People feel like they're being taken for granted, that their concerns are dismissed, that the political class lives in a bubble completely disconnected from normal people's lives and values. When you see your government spending hundreds of hours bringing back someone who hates Britain while telling you there's no money for the NHS or social care or infrastructure, the conclusion that you're being played for a fool is hard to avoid. Armstrong's question about James Cleverly and other Tory MPs was important because it forced Jenrick to confront the fact that this isn't purely partisan. Both parties have contributed to this mess. The Conservatives granted the citizenship and lobbied for the release. Labour continued that effort and then publicly celebrated the outcome. It's a bipartisan failure, which actually makes it worse because it suggests the problem is deeper than just one party's ideology or competence. It's systemic. Jenrick's willingness to criticize his own party's decision shows a level of intellectual honesty that's rare in politics. He could have just blamed Labour and left it at that, but by acknowledging the Conservative government's role in granting citizenship, by saying he's ashamed of that decision, he's putting principle over party loyalty. That's not to mean he's not also using this for political advantage. Of course he is.